Hey, welcome back to California Battleground. This is your host, Rob Karinke. Last week we talked about the earthquake that no one knew had happened in California government. And this week we're going to be extending on some of those ideas and talking about, I guess the aftershocks of that earthquake. But I think also a great deal about some of the underlying root causes of how we got to where we are and how that really is a window into the future of California government. So, for anyone who wasn't with us last week, we talked a lot about the ways in which the Republican Party in California, after years of dominating local government offices and fundamentally the pipeline to higher office, starting in 2016, went into a free fall. And they've lost hundreds of these mayor and council member seats during that period. And are down to now only about a third of seats, down from having nearly half of them just a few years ago. And we talked a lot about the reasons why we thought that was. A lot of it, mostly political. We talked about a lot of the political factors driving that, the Trump era, a lot of increased organizing by the Democratic Party and Democratic aligned groups. Also, a lot of structural changes that have driven this, moves to district-based elections, changes to the calendar of elections in California. But we didn't spend a lot of time on last week. What I really want to focus on this week is the issues that have really shaped that change, because there are some real shifts in the way policy is driving voter behavior. And I think that, as much as anything that we talked about last week, is really what is going to drive change in the future. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about, why cities exist in California, how they came to be, and what really drove a lot of municipalization in California. So more than a quarter of California cities were incorporated between basically the end of World War II and about 1970. And a large number of those were in suburban Southern California, to a degree in the Bay Area and elsewhere. But a lot of LA and Orange County and Inland Empire cities. And, a lot of these cities were indicative of areas that were candidly heavily white, and really pretty conservative on issues such as housing growth, public safety, and local taxes. And indeed, a lot of them remain pretty conservative on a lot of those issues. But the political party that's branded along those issues, low taxes, local control, the strong support of public safety, is starting to flounder. Even in nonpartisan races and in local races. And so, kind of why is that? And again, we've talked about the politics, but I think if you think in terms of the issues that are driving voter behavior, I think back to even, the early 2000s and, what were progressive activists focused on? Well, it was pretty squarely on federal issues, things like the Iraq War and healthcare and, yes, climate. But today, progressives have zeroed in on local governments, on issues like sustainability, yes, but also housing, policing, cannabis, and I think even really budget making has started to really come to the fore in voters' minds. And so I think it's kind of difficult to measure the impact of any given policy on the kinds of candidates that run and win local seats. But I think it is unquestionable that the hot button political issues have to a large degree become these local government issues. And advocates have realized that city councils, regardless of what state law may allow, have tremendous power to actualize policy. Right. So if you want cannabis sales in your city, or you want housing to be built, just because a California law allows or encourages such activity, it's typically a local city council that is going to either bar that activity or actually make it materialize. And so this has drawn candidates, I think, with a much stronger ideological agenda to local elections, and it's galvanized outside groups around local races in substantially new ways. And so I want to kind of go through really some of these key issues and ways in which I think I can demonstrate that this is a new and burgeoning phenomenon. So I think if we start with environment, and environmental activism at the city council level is not new. I actually dug off some of my archives in the library here. I have a Bulletin on Municipal Foreign Policy. This was a newsletter magazine. The issue I have is dated in summer 1990. And it's called The Greenhouse Century, Cities Face Global Warming. Has interviews with mayors all across the country, including a pretty splashy piece here with a young San Diego City Councilman, Bob Filner, who watches the California politics will recall was embroiled in a scandal, which really opened the door to San Diego Mayor Kevin Falconer. Now involved in the recall election, but suffice to say, there's actually another issue I couldn't surface that has a young mayor from Burlington, Vermont, Bernard Sanders, with a large profile on environmental issues. Activism by local mayors and council members on environmental issues is not really new. But in California, I think that they have organized in a way in which they really have not in the past. And I think where environmental interests have fallen short in the state capital with desired outcomes, and it hasn't been in a lot of places, they've had a lot of success, but places where they have fallen short, I think there's now a practiced and pretty routine effort to take fights into City Hall. An example: 150 cities passed a plastic bag ban. There's been almost equal a number passed styrofoam bans, and virtually all of them in the last 10 years. Dozens of cities and counties have banned fracking in that same period, even where there's no oil drilling. And where there is oil extraction in California, in LA and in Ventura County in particular, but even in smaller Central Valley communities, you're seeing increased local activism on that issue. And the environmental justice community has gotten a lot more active, say in the Central Valley around water issues, and in certainly the urban parts of Southern California. And I think that some of this is organic grassroots activity. But I also think, to a large degree, there's a strategic initiative by environmental groups to kind of Swiss cheese local regulations and force the hand of the legislature to enact statewide policy or prime the pump for ballot action on these issues. And I think, you could see that take place in real time if you take a look at the plastic bag ban, and the way that progressed through California cities. And I've got some graphs on this if you're watching on the YouTube channel, or you can get them at californiacitynews.org. But I won't rely on the graphics, but you can go get them for a visualization of what's going on here. Plastic bag bans began in California really in earnest in about 2008. And you had basically two cities take the lead on that: Malibu and Fairfax in Marin County. But as you start to progress through, the ensuing years, what you see is a proliferation of these then to more kind of progressive center cities, your Santa Monica, cities in the Bay Area, some Monterey Bay communities. And then the issue really takes off in 2013, 2014, and you see dozens of cities start to pass these. And while you do see some in LA, it's really again from those kind of leading edge type cities, your West Hollywood, your Culver City, places like that. There was City of LA did take action, which is not to be discounted, fairly notable. But I think what I'd really point out is the way in which the Bay Area, achieves near unanimity in a very, very short period of time. And, from there, when you get into 2015, 2016, the run up to the statewide ban in 2016, you see that position consolidate in the Bay Area, where practically every Bay Area city has it. You still only have, about a dozen or so cities in Southern California, a couple dozen maybe, that have taken such action. And again, not nothing, but virtually nowhere in the interior of the state. You have some college towns like Davis, Chico, and Arcata take action. South Lake Tahoe, some of the more progressive, retiree type communities and tourism based places. But fundamentally, it's a Bay Area phenomenon. And pretty soon you start passing a few dozen of these bans, and you get to this magic number of, there's 100 cities that have taken this action, and that is then used to leverage Sacramento to try and enact a statewide policy to sort of level the playing field, so to speak. This is becoming, I think, a kind of tried and true path that you're seeing on environmental issues. And I think it's also a testament to the strength of the Bay Area acting kind of in unison, and I think to a degree kind of the homogenous aspect of some of these policies and the way they proliferate there, and then start to spread out to other places. So again, environmental advocacy not new at the municipal level, but in a much more organized way, and I think on much more granular issues. There's always been kind of sustainability plans in California cities, but now it's a much stronger component of local policy making. And indeed, this is another place where you see a lot of groups, League of Conservation Voters, Surfrider, other localized groups that are taking a much stronger interest in local municipal elections, and that is affecting change at the local level. Um, Moving on to another issue that I think is really central, obviously, is housing, right? And I think the centrality of land use authority and local control as a concept really cannot be understated as the DNA of local cities in California, especially in suburban California and much of the LA basin, greater Southern California. The only real reasons to incorporate a city are to have more control over your housing policy, um, and your public safety policies. You could argue taxes, but taxes in incorporated areas actually tend to be higher than unincorporated areas. In fact, I grew up in an unincorporated area in Contra Costa County, and there were municipalization efforts defeated on the basis of keeping taxes lower. So, I mean, that's anecdotal, but I know it to be true. Um, Now, consider now that many of the LA and Orange County cities that incorporated in the post-war era, that era in which you had this big proliferation of cities as the state was growing, a lot of those cities that incorporated turned right around and contracted back with the county sheriff, with the county fire department for their public safety services. So you gain more control over your policing, but you don't even create a police department. I think you start to get a sense of why housing policies are so closely held by cities, and just how central that is, and how big a deal it is that it is now becoming such a hot button issues. In the 2000s, it was common to see developers and environmentalists sparring over individual housing developments. There was the notion of sprawl that was definitely a big issue, and there were environmental groups that were arrayed and allied against it. But it was kind of, I mean, forgive me, but it was kind of like squabbling between these groups. And again, a lot of times it's centered around, really specific developments. And there were one-off kinds of fights. Once you have the housing meltdown and now moving into today's housing crisis, there's much larger fights that have emerged around, YIMBYism, yes in my backyard, versus the NIMBYs, and a pronounced awareness of younger voters on city council's role in permitting housing. I think I talked about last week, seeing college kids advocating on the RENA process, the housing needs assessment done by planning organizations. That's not something you would have expected to see in 2005. Rent control is another one. And, rent control dates back. I mean, there were big fights in places like Santa Monica in the 1970s. Not a lot of California cities have rent control. You can count them on a hand or two, but there have been actually over a dozen rent control initiatives appear on local ballots just in the last 2 years. It even predates the pandemic, and the pandemic has only really exacerbated a lot of those fights. There was, in fact, a candidate in Burbank last fall who campaigned on a rent control initiative himself for city council. And though the initiative failed, he secured that seat. So he kind of rolled that issue into a council seat. And I think that this is very much a function of demography as well. If you look at the population of seniors in California, California is a much, much older place than it used to be. In 1950, there were about 1.6 million seniors in California, people over the age of 60. Here we are today, probably closer to 9 million. And the projections from the state show that is set to, maybe nearly double again over the next 20 to 25 years. So California is aging. And it is not building any more housing either. The home ownership rate in California has actually remained remarkably steady since the 1960s, in the kind of high 50%. But the home ownership rate among younger Californians, among people 25 to 35 years old, has fallen, by half in that time, and among 35 to 45-year-olds, by nearly that much. It's fallen by 20 points, up from down from a high of probably 65% home ownership rate, down well under 50 and down towards 40%. So you have an older population that owns their home. And a younger population, which is a much smaller share of the total electorate who are renting. Not surprisingly, this also starts to reflect itself in kind of regionalism. If you take a look at LA County and where people own versus rent, it is this donut effect where you have this incredibly high concentration of renters, based in central Los Angeles in the city of LA, and on the west side, out to Santa Monica, to a degree down in Long Beach, yes, but all throughout the San Fernando Valley, San Gabriel Valley, down through Cerritos and back around up through the South Bay is predominantly homeowners and owner occupied units. Well, that is starting to reflect itself in a lot of different ways in our politics. And this housing issue is driving an incredible amount of energy. Certainly we see a lot in the state capitol going on around it, but at city halls as well. I think it's also worth noting the degree to which land use. These battles have gotten really very heated, even within the local government community. I think that the probably the largest cleave in local government land in my tenure, going back 20 years, was the fight over SB 375. This was then Senate Pro Tem Darrell Steinberg's bill, now Mayor of Sacramento, that basically used regional transportation planning to try and kind of quote improve land use and transportation policy, essentially to drive transit oriented development. Essentially, it was pretty prescriptive in the ways in which the state would grow and the choices cities would make. The League of Cities ultimately supported this bill along with the building industry and indeed a lot of environmental groups. And this enraged, a lot of more conservative cities, and it actually led to a breakaway group of Orange County cities, and a group that still exists today, the Association of California Cities Orange County. It dates to that exact moment, right? So it's this closely held land use authority and the notion that cities are in control of their destiny in terms of how much they grow that has been kind of gradually subverted by state laws. And there are routinely now every legislative session attempts to try and compel more growth by certain factions of the legislature among cities that have thus far proved largely unsuccessful. But it's a chipping away there. And I think one of the things it's sort of chipping away at is the identity of a lot of the local governments that, again, founded 50, 60 years ago. It's not true across the board, but certainly in a lot of suburban parts of California, a lot of places where homeowners reside, want to continue to be able to control their growth patterns and how many people live there, and that is coming into direct conflict with a younger generation of voters, and one that I think has really woken up to the fact that it's the cities on the hook for these issues. So related to housing, but I think a distinct issue is homelessness, which has obviously exploded across California in the last 10 years. And formerly, I think really a province of large cities, as certainly San Francisco, the financial district, the Tenderloin had homelessness going back 30, 40 years. You had Skid Row in LA, but homelessness now affects every community in California from Redding to Brawley, and it's in suburban California, and people are basically fed up with the issue, and that crosses ideological spectrums. And it's a consistent topic of state legislation. It's put local office holders in a pretty precarious position with their voters, as a pretty powerful anti-incumbent message. The siting of homeless shelters is a toxic process in local communities. And you've got an array of groups petitioning city councils on all sides of that debate around encampments, around homeless housing. And you have a pretty complicated and difficult judicial gauntlet that cities have to run, that presses them on most sides. But again, it's a powerful anti-incumbent cudgel. Addressing root causes of homelessness is likely beyond the scope of any individual local politician. But at the same time, any incremental steps to enact local solutions are going to be met with fierce opposition from local residents, and they come at a pretty great political cost. I think a very recent example of this would be the recently unseated LA City Council member David Rue. He represented a district that kind of runs from Koreatown up through Hollywood into Sherman Oaks. So pretty diverse district, not only demographically, but certainly by income and by density as well. He's defeated last fall by Nithya Raman, who was kind of became like a progressive figurehead in LA in the last year. Had a lot of celebrity backing and certainly a lot of energy and support from progressive groups. And her defeat of Rue was really heralded as this landmark victory for progressives in LA, which you'd certainly say it was. Rue himself was nonetheless, a fairly progressive member by the standards of just a few years ago, and was certainly an outsider when he ran. He defeated the chief of staff of the sitting member, ran as an outsider, and now his like one-term tenure was basically besieged by the homeless issue, and he made it a focus of his term. He had like an 8-point plan to address it, and I think legitimately did make a lot of progress on this. But it's kind of situation where there's not enough moving of the needle on the issue, and fundamentally nobody is happy, right? He goes to the suburban parts of the district, like in Sherman Oaks, and gets booed by HOAs. The NIMBYs all over the district are railing against any plans for local shelters. Meanwhile, progressives are beating him up, for the humanitarian crisis that's going on. There's rises in property crime and petty theft, and people just feel less safe. There's public health dimensions to this, and the council member becomes kind of boxed in on all sides. His opponent, now Councilwoman Rahman, she founds a neighborhood homeless coalition, and I think ousts him largely on failings around the homelessness issue. And this is just one example, right? But it's indicative of things that are playing out across the 500 cities. And homelessness, likely to only be exacerbated by the pandemic, and certainly not going away, and something that I think is going to be with us for a very long time. Policing and crime. So gang violence, certainly in large cities, was a key issue in the 1990s and into the 2000s. It's the kind of thing where, for years, if you polled a local community about their number one concern, crime and gang violence would have been, right up there with traffic. It's probably one of the larger issues. That has, largely vanished in favor of homelessness. Homelessness is almost every city that I work in, and see scientific polling on homelessness would be the number one issue. But I think as crime rates fell, the issue did shift substantially. And part of this was Governor Brown's, quote, devolutionary approach to prisoner overcrowding in the state, and dealing with, again, judicial decisions that really started to compel prisoner release and ultimately led to AB 109. And there are a lot of angst around that in local communities, the implementation of that, and there have been measurable increases, certainly in petty crime. But I think more profoundly, the civil rights movement around policing is very, very much a local government issue. And advocates in cities, large and small, increasingly advocate on this, not only in public meetings, but increasingly at local government officials' homes. We've seen protests, around, concerning masking and reopening, kind of pandemic-driven protests that have moved moved out of City Hall and onto the driveways of elected officials. The police reform, I think, is where we really started to see that in the last few years, and it's become very, very confrontational. And there's also an inverse of that movement, and a pushback against the quote defunding of the police. That's been a campaign issue that I've seen used to success in various kinds of communities, including the Central Valley, in a lot of suburban areas. Crime and public safety is a much, much different issue than it was 10 or 15 years ago. And again, it's another example of, I think, the way in which these issues that dominate even national politics and national debate are playing out in a very visceral way at the local level. I think if you want a pretty strong proxy for how the policing issue is playing in local communities, you could look at the DA's race from LA County last year, where I think it was 3-term incumbent Jackie Lacey lost to George Gascon, who had transplanted himself from San Francisco and run again. A very strong progressive campaign, kind of like we were talking about with David Rue and Nithya Raman, but very, very much centered on policing, criminal justice reform, sentencing reform. And if you look at how that vote played out, Lacey nearly avoided a runoff in the primary. She almost got 50%. Kind of an ongoing testament to the differences in the primary electorate in California. But again, just as I showed in the housing issue, where you have a very high concentration of renters in the central part of Los Angeles and this kind of ring around the county of homeowners, the vote for Lacey and Gascon almost identically mirrors that, right? And you have the suburban parts of certainly the Antelope Valley, but to a large degree the San Fernando Valley, although George Gascon did very well in the valley. But going out to the San Gabriel Valley, going out to places like Cerritos, in Palos Verdes, in the South Bay, those areas are voting in a much more conservative way. And again, Jackie Lacey, I don't think most people would have called a conservative a few years ago. She was the first African-American DA in LA, first woman, a Democrat, but she faces this progressive challenge on her left. The politics of LA County are increasingly becoming about this old versus young, homeowner versus renter, probably left of center, some conservative, but basically left of center versus progressive. And it's playing out in the local politics, and it's becoming very clear across issues. Cannabis is another one. So 57% of California voters approved Proposition 64 that legalized recreational cannabis in 2016. To this day, only about 170 out of 550 cities and counties, or like 480 cities and 58 counties, only 170 of them currently permit for cannabis. And if you look just at the cities themselves, Prop 64 passed in nearly 400 of the cities, but you have less than a third of them actually permitting. And the ones that technically do, many of them are severely limited. They only permit a few shops or businesses. Or like the city of LA, the permit's actually a fair amount, are very, very dysfunctional. So 4 years after legalization, there's actually only 700 storefront retailers of recreational cannabis in the state. Nearly a third of those are in 5 cities: LA, Long Beach, San Francisco, Santa Ana, and Sacramento. So this is something that has drawn in a lot of not only new businesses, cannabis interests, but certainly activists around the cannabis issue. That is something that you really would not have seen in local government 10 or 15 years ago. And, guess what the highest correlate is to whether or not a city's permitting cannabis? It's the partisanship of the local council. And I think that people have started to latch onto that. It's not a totally one-to-one relationship, but it's a very, very strong correlation. And kind of it's another kind of NIMBYism, or it's certainly a reluctance among a lot of smaller communities that are difficult to really say that they're conservative communities based on the way that they vote, but are pretty conservative when it comes to issues like this. And again, you have basically only 700 permitted businesses 4 years after legalization. There's like 8,000 liquor stores in California. I think that there's over 2,500 Starbucks, and I don't know what the bar is for how many liquor stores or Starbucks you ought to have to cannabis businesses, but it's certainly trailing far, far behind for an allegedly legal business. And that is a place where you are starting to see a lot of money and organizing starting to come into California local elections, and again driving the change that we've been talking about. Last but not least is pension and budget, the most exciting of all these issues. But, again, as a watchword, fiscal responsibility was probably the most common refrain, regardless of party affiliation, for years when you saw people running for local office. Everyone wanted a safe and clean community. They also were, a bastion of fiscal responsibility. It was like in every candidate statement. But the financial crisis and the burgeoning pension debt of local cities has made this a far more salient issue. What is the unfunded pension liability of California cities? It's kind of tough to get like a real answer. The official CalPERS number is merely $200 billion, and that of course includes state governments as well. But a lot of this debt exists in local cities, and other studies have come out that peg this number of not just pension debt, but all state and local liabilities, including bond debt and other unfunded liabilities, at 1.5 trillion in California. Um, that is it's obviously an an enormous number. It has drawn in, again, not just activism on both sides, but really kind of like visceral conversations about how the governments are going to operate. It's obviously an enormous issue for labor, and labor takes, as they always have, a very strong hand. Public employee unions in local elections, um, but it has really constrained a lot of local governments' ability to operate. Most of them have never recovered from their staffing levels going back to the original financial crisis. I saw a study of Bay Area cities that said most of them are operating with 7% less staff than they did a decade ago. That's basically in line with numbers that have been put out nationwide, where cities are 8 to 10% below. But the regular city budgeting process, right? You have these large unfunded liabilities, which can become kind of a campaigning issue, and certainly is a place where labor is going to take a very strong interest because they're their pensions. But the regular city budget process is also seeing kind of previously unseen grassroots engagement. In some of these ways, it's a more formalized process. Vallejo in 2012 established the first citywide participatory budgeting process in the United States. There's a number of cities, I think Salinas and a few others, that have some form of that process now. Oakland's been a leader in that regard. They were the first U.S. city to use participatory budgeting to allocate federal block grant dollars. So you're seeing a lot of kind of formalized community engagement around budgeting. In Long Beach, there's a people's budget that gets proposed. It's a little bit more of an outside group. It's something that gets a lot of attention. But by and large, you're seeing a much greater degree and a much higher interest in kind of the nuts and bolts of where money is being spent, and a lot more engagement of the community within that in the last 10 years than you certainly would have seen, I think, at any time prior. So we've talked a lot about the politics of California cities and the way in which macro trends of blue California and resistance to Trumpism and so forth have really driven a lot of new people and a lot of new groups into the electoral process and local government. But I think, as I hope I have outlined in the last 30 minutes or so, a lot of the issues have really shifted as well. And again, I think that there was always activism in California cities. There were always, key issues that were debated, but never before, I don't believe, have the state and national issues converged with local policy debates and local elections in the way that they have now. It is also clear, in the data and the numbers, that Democrats have been coming out with the upper hand on those issues, even on issues that historically would have played very well to Republican candidates. Things like, again, fiscal responsibility, low taxes, and local control. So, what does that mean for like where we're headed? I think that these issues: environment, housing, homelessness, cannabis to a degree, and certainly the budget issues are going to continue to be with us for some time. I think there's also some emerging issues. Certainly, public health and the pandemic and the fallout from that, I think, is something that we will start to see emerge in local elections. I think that wildfire is an enormous issue in large parts of the state. In between wildfire and kind of coastal protection and coastal plans, and how coastal cities are going to survive or protect themselves against climate change. The climate issue, I think, is going to drive a lot of local elections. You also, going back to the budgeting issue, are seeing prospectively lower thresholds for lower taxes, or for raising taxes. There have been court decisions that have potentially opened up fundamentally loopholes that will make it easier to drive new taxes to address some of the issues above. That is also going to greatly impact how the elections play out. All of that is then going to lead to of an extremely interesting political scene in California local government, which is going to have a direct impact on California state government, with half of the legislature set to term out. A lot of these local elected officials are going to be moving into state office, and again, I think that you have this sort of inside-outside game between the capital and the state's municipalities in driving issues and policy, and a much more activist local government community that is driving the ball on a lot of policy issues. And so, I would say it's like a tail wag the dog situation, but you kind of have local government with a much stronger hand in shaping the way California grows and responds to the issues of its residents. So that is going to put a cap on episode 2 of California Battleground. Future episodes are going to focus again on some of the regions and drill into more of some of these issues. But I think we've done enough table setting here, and I've probably exhausted my decade in review concept here. I want to thank you for taking a listen. Obviously, it would be awesome if you subscribed and shared these episodes. Thanks again, and I will see you again.